Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the JAFFA podcast on Bold Like a Leopard. And today we're going to talk about free speech debates and issues regarding the Israel-Palestine conflict. So I recently made a video where really a podcast, just like everything I'm doing right now, has to be audio because I'm driving in a car. I don't really have a good camera with me. But recently I did a podcast episode where I was talking about really some of my thoughts about the conflict, given the fact that my family experienced a loss, and that one of my cousins lost his daughter, who was actually, her name was Adi Baruch, who actually was one of the kids that I had a closer tie to when I lived in Israel. She was only about 9 years old when I left, and that was more of a personal observation, as well as hopefully a tribute to her and her memory. But I'm gonna have to depart a little bit and talk more about free speech issues, because regardless of my own personal loss and the loss of her parents and the families and community around her, I don't feel like people have to be censored for their views on the Israel-Palestine conflict. That doesn't mean I think every view is intelligent or correct or actually offers any value, because a lot of people have opinions that don't contribute anything to a subject, right? There's many people, for example, they try to start a sports podcast, and it'll all be about, like, let's say you're a big fan of the New York Jets, and then day after day after day, it'll be about whether Aaron Rodgers was the right move in terms of a trade or not. And at a certain point, if you keep repeating the same thing and the conversation becomes played, people start to look at you as a broken record. And that's the way I look at a lot of the commentary on the Israel-Palestine conflict. People don't have original ideas. They'll fit into certain camps that are very cookie cutter in terms of their approach, or they're just ideological, right? So they don't actually look at the reality on the ground. They talk about only the bedrock principles that motivate them to look at the conflict as a whole. They don't realize maybe something has changed, maybe a decision has to be taken differently based on what's happening. So I think the lion's share of the focus today in terms of freedom of speech will be on the left and some of their outrageous forms of expression, but also a little bit of cancel culture that's being leveled against them, some censorship, but not all of it is censorship, and I'm going to try to make some distinctions. A lot of it is actually fair game. Some people yell censorship when in reality they don't have necessarily the right to complain about censorship in some cases. So there have been a lot of outbreaks of massive demonstrations, not only in cities like Istanbul, Turkey, or in other parts of the Middle East like Cairo or the Gulf states. There have been a lot of demonstrations here in the U.S. I saw yesterday in L.A. there was a 50,000 person demonstration to free Palestine and to, I don't know whether they were one of those groups that was yelling for a ceasefire, which I'll also get to that inane viewpoint, but there was 50,000 people in LA. There was another massive demonstration in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. There were big demonstrations many demonstrations in London. Like London, I would say, is probably pro-Palestine central. There was even a train conductor that was suspended for yelling out one of the Palestinian chants. I think it was the "From the River to the Sea" chant. So he's been suspended. And there have been people, and he should be suspended. But the point is that across the West, this whole conflict has exposed the passions of a subset of society that is deeply, deeply committed to Palestine as their cause. There are certain countries where that dedication is almost the cultural norm. I would say Spain is. I would say probably Ireland. There's a number of countries throughout Europe where Germany, there's a strong current in terms of at least the migrant populations. Maybe not necessarily Germans per se, but Germany has a massive Turkish immigrant population. So in a lot of these nations, yes, there's this deep and abiding will among people, whether it's migrant populations who have sympathy or the left-wing side of the spectrum who want there to be a Palestinian state, or going even further. And I'm not saying this is probably a strong plurality of the people who are in that camp, that they don't want Israel to exist, period. They believe in the maximalist definition of the Palestinian cause, that Israel is a settler colonial state and that it has to be replaced by a state for the Palestinian people, or a one-state solution where the Jewish identity of Israel is abolished and is simply a secular state where both ethnicities and religions have basically the same identity status within the society. Those are very strong currents. It's not some sort of fringe belief system in some of these societies. Now, in the United States, I wouldn't say the majority of people tend to care, but in certain cities, Chicago, New York, LA, Detroit, all over the country. In the Midwest, there's several cities that have had sizable pro-Palestine demonstrations. That there's simply a culture that is regional, that is very, very pro-Palestine. Now, Alan Dershowitz actually made a video yesterday. He made an interesting point that he doesn't believe that any of these demonstrations, whether on a college campus or in major cities, is actually pro-Palestine, because if they were, they would be having at least a few people that would be chanting, calling for the two-state solution, which he says is the only way to solve the crisis. And none of them are supporting it. But I think Dershowitz is wrong. The pro-Palestine cause, despite the wishes of many people who wanted there to be peace and a negotiated solution, the pro-Palestine side has rejected compromise. They have embraced irredentism, the totalist view that you cannot have a compromise. It has to be either all or nothing. It's a zero-sum game. And the longer Dershowitz continues to cling to that rhetorical point that he's pro-Palestine because he wants there to be a sustainable Palestinian state under this two-state solution, therefore the people who are anti-Israel are also not really pro-Palestine, he's absolutely wrong. That's like saying Irish Republicans are not actually pro-Irish, right? They're not Irish nationalists because they're not going to necessarily get Northern Ireland back into Irish control. It's not really a serious talking point. But anyway, beyond that, there have been a number of ramifications for people who either have demonstrated or made proclamations on behalf of Palestinian solidarity, or have, in other cases, been seen doing certain things in furtherance of that. So we'll go through. I want to say each category, and I want to give you my take as a First Amendment advocate on each one of them, because I like to be fair, even if I don't like the people that I'm talking about. And certainly, I'm going to be bringing up a number of examples of people that I find to be despicable. They're just terrible people. Their views are terrible. They're not logical. They're very emotional, and their goals are in my opinion, contemptible. So anyway, those people that signed on to some of the original pledges that came in the wake of the October 7th Palestinian attacks on Israel, which were led by Hamas, but it wasn't exclusively Hamas. Those people have, in some cases, been blacklisted from hedge funds or law firms. A couple people had offers revoked for jobs with law firms. Bill Ackman, the founder of I think it's called Pershing Square. Pershing Square is his hedge fund. He said, yeah, I want the names of these people, and so do a lot of other people that work on Wall Street with me, because we don't want to take the chance that we're going to hire one of these lunatics. Is this First Amendment friendly or not? It is. Why? Because here's the reason, okay? People are calling this cancel culture. Cancel culture is if I am somebody else, let's say I have somebody else, they work for me as, I don't know, like I have a business where I make, key lime pies or something. I have a bakery. They work at my bakery. And this person holds certain views where they talk on Reddit about how they don't think women should be in the workplace. They think they should stay in the kitchen and shut up, and the man should have control of the home or whatever. Well, cancel culture would be if other Reddit users, they would see his comments online and they would come to me as the employer and they'd say, hey, you better fire this guy, or you're gonna have consequences for your business. We're gonna picket your business. We're gonna tell people not to buy there. We're gonna do all these things in order to make sure that you suffer as a consequence of keeping this person on your payroll, right? So that would be cancel culture. You're a third party. It's basically, I believe in law, some would call it tortious interference, that a third party goes into a relationship between two others and tries to create a wedge between them to no actual benefit, and they're not injured by it. That would be the equivalent of what cancel culture is, because those people weren't affected really by what this guy might have posted on Reddit. And this is, of course, an imaginary scenario, but it's happened in real life. There are people who, the examples that I always cite happened mostly in the years 2018, 2019. There was specifically, the one I can always remember was Villanova University. Their basketball team had a point guard. I'm going to put this in an article. So this podcast might come out with or before or after an article I'm actually writing right now. So the example I always use is of Dante DiVincenzo. He was a very accomplished point guard for Villanova University. He actually had won a national championship before, and he was winning his second national championship with them as a starter. And he was actually blasted after he'd already won, and his name was going viral for his basketball accomplishments. They released an article that I don't remember who, but there was a journalist who had dug up dirt for this exact moment, where he had tweeted in 2011 or so, when he was maybe 14 years old, he had tweeted rap lyrics about Derrick Rose that apparently used the N-word. And people tried to cancel him over that. That's cancel culture. When people try to take comments or ideas that you've expressed and they don't have anything to do with you and try to get you fired. Bill Ackman is not practicing cancel culture. It's one thing for somebody else to come to your job and tell your employer that you shouldn't be allowed to work there. It's another thing for the employer to actually say, hey, I've seen what these people say, and I don't want anybody like this at my company. I'm sorry. I have certain opinions of my own. Bill Ackman happens to be Jewish. I don't know about his other political opinions. Some of them I've seen are not ones I agree with, but I'm not going to tell him how to run Pershing Square. And there was also Davis Polk, a law firm. They revoked job offers from a couple people, I think from UPenn and from Harvard and maybe even Columbia. Those people, they don't have an intrinsic right to work at a law firm or at Pershing Square. They can, and here's another issue that I find, that many of these people, they talk about their commitment to a cause and how they look at it as an expression of how they apply their ideals to their real life. Well, if you want to apply your ideals to your real life, don't work at a company that doesn't agree with your ideals. You shouldn't want to work at a company where people are so committed to ideals that are diametrically opposed to you. If this should be actually a benefit to them. But find a law firm that says, yeah, we love Palestine, we love massacres of innocent civilians without any like real strategic benefit to your cause. That's something which, by the way, is really the other issue. Okay, so there are cases, I would say, that I've observed. I don't have any off the top of my head, but I do know of cases where, under that definition of cancel culture, which I gave, where people ask employers, do they want to employ somebody? Actually, there is an example with the Department of Homeland Security. There was a discovery that a person from U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security, her name I think was Nejwa Ali. So they observed that this lady had been making extremely inflammatory posts regarding the events in Gaza, where she was applauding the slaughter of innocents and also condemning Israel and talking about Israel in very disparaging terms. So they got her suspended. Why do I think that this is a valid form of cancel culture? Well, this is a woman who it turned out that she'd been an employee of the Palestine Liberation Organization. And do you think somebody like this has the should be allowed, who issues public statements like this? So they have they should be allowed to issue asylum status to potential illegal aliens, especially given right now we're dealing with a situation where the FBI is slowly acknowledging that yes, terror suspects could be slipping over the southern border when we would have no idea who they are, because some people, they talk about the ones that get stopped at the border who are on the terror watch list. And a lot of what's been discussed is that for everyone that's caught, we don't know how many are getting through undetected, the gotaways. But I would add to that, and I was listening to the Bongino show yesterday, on top of that issue, you have to consider the fact that many of these operatives could be totally unknown. They're not known because they haven't been active up until now. So there could be people who are unknown unknowns, right? As Donald Rumsfeld would have said. So people have to look at this from a more elevated perspective here. That yes, cancel culture, broadly speaking, isn't something good, and having somebody be prohibited from, kicked out of their job icing cupcakes is, just because they said something that was disparaging about Brie Larson and Captain Marvel. That's a little different from somebody who may have a pivotal position and their opinions may reflect certain problems with the way that they would perform their job. They can't be considered to be impartial. In fact, think about it this way: it could potentially be a civil rights issue if you keep her in her position, because what would happen if there is an asylum seeker who's coming from Israel, hypothetically, right? I'm not saying that this is likely, but she couldn't be considered impartial, or she could be considered too preferential to people that are asylum seekers from the Palestinian Authority. This is something that people have to, take their own personal biases out of it for a second. And there was also a case where I believe this student who was a senior official at NYU's law school, she was or within the student body government, she was also canceled for her views on the conflict. So there are gray areas here where I would say I don't necessarily agree with all of the decisions to fire people or whatever. There was a case of an editor in Britain for a science journal who has lost his job over simply retweeting an Onion article. I'm not agreeing with every example here. And I certainly don't agree with people like Nikki Haley that say that anti-Zionism by definition is anti-Semitism. I think that there are shades of gray here and there. And we should always encourage there to be freedom of speech as much as possible. But that also doesn't mean that I think every example of somebody having adverse consequences for something they said, did, or wrote, I don't think every single example of that is cancel culture. There are also people who have been basically outed, and I think in at least a couple cases lost their jobs or had consequences with their employer for ripping down posters of the hostages who are being held by Hamas in Gaza. So here's a different issue. If those posters are in a place where the person who owns the space specifically said, yeah, you have permission to post this here, yeah, go right ahead, then this is vandalism. You're not actually, it's on the contrary, it's not freedom of speech when you destroy somebody else's stuff, right? So people talk about, and I know somebody on the other side, I know somebody who is pro-Israel who has gotten in trouble for destroying something that was a pro-Palestine display, and he had charges pressed against him because that was vandalism, and he was convicted and given a suspended sentence. So there are limits one limit to freedom of speech is if it's beyond speech. If you're taking action and doing something physical, getting physical, whether to somebody else's property or to their self, you've exceeded the bounds of freedom of speech. Other examples would be, as I'm seeing possible, these aren't clear-cut examples, but I'm seeing things that are happening in places like London and Toronto. There are demonstrators who are going to Jewish businesses and picketing them and basically menacing the customers and telling them not to go inside and things like that. That is a borderline example of where freedom of speech becomes harassment, because and there's another issue with that I wanted to unpack for a minute. The businesses that tend to be picketed, or in some cases synagogues. I think in Barcelona there were synagogues that were vandalized. In Germany there were Jewish homes where people had taken paint and daubed Jewish stars on them. That is definitely beyond the pale in terms of whether it's free speech or not, because you're actually, first of all, it is also vandalism, but it is basically threatening the person. And, it has nothing to do with Zionism. A synagogue is a Jewish institution. A synagogue can be totally not Zionist. It could be both. It could even be anti-Zionist. There are sects of Judaism where the believers are, very much opposed to even the existence of a Jewish state until the Messiah arrives. So, I wouldn't consider them to be good representatives. They're not they're certainly not the consensus opinion. But, a Jewish house of worship is just that. It's not a Zionist institution. There are Jewish houses of worship where the tendency is more pro-Zionist, for example. I've been to those, and there are certainly ones that are pretty obvious, but as a whole they are not as a definition Zionist institutions, and they have nothing to do necessarily with Israel. And that's typically been the viewpoint of many anti-Zionists for many years. They say, well, we're not anti-Jewish, we're not Jew haters. We criticize the state of Israel. The Jewish people. So some people even go so far to say the Jewish people have nothing to do with the land of Israel, with Zionism and the land of Israel. You know, they go even further. They go nuts, and they're like, why would I hate the Jews? The Jews have nothing to do with Israel, which is also a ridiculous statement. But they tried to make a distinction. But what inevitably happens is that there is a synagogue or a Jewish institution, like a daycare or a supermarket or whatever it is, something that's either owned by Jews or used by the Jewish community, that gets vandalized or picketed or targeted by these people. And, so in some cases, God forbid, they actually have an attack on them. And, the motive has to do with Israel. Well, in that case, you're not talking about anti-Zionism. You're talking about explicit Jew hatred. It's not, you can couch it in terms of Gaza and occupation all you want, but you've basically shown your ass. So moving on from that, what I also want to say is that all of this talk about cancel culture with respect to the Palestinians, I've defended the rights of Palestinian supporters in terms of freedom of speech in the past. I've defended the rights of people, and worse than that, people who are actual hate mongers, who are, they're out and out anti-Semites. I've defended, 9/11 truthers that believe that Israel has these are actually stupid ideas that I've been able to debate and, in my opinion, disprove in the past. Right, but I believe if people want to blame Israel for 9/11 and talk about the dancing Israelis and things like that, you have the First Amendment. I've also, defended in my writing the rights of Holocaust deniers. I've defended the rights of race realists and all of those people. So I don't speak with forked tongue when I talk about my commitment to freedom of speech and the First Amendment, even when it comes to people that I find to be totally and utterly despicable. So I find it interesting, though, that one of the places where pro-Palestine demonstrators decided to picket was the community of Skokie, Illinois, which is north of Chicago. I've actually never been to Skokie. I think it was in neighboring Evanston very briefly. Chicago's a beautiful city, but it's in terrible shape right now. Anyway, so they decided to picket, I believe it was like some Jewish deli over there. So picketing a Jewish business that's not actually, intrinsically tied to Israel, right? And then on top of that, okay, so even if they are a pro-Zionist deli or whatever, so you're not actually striking the people, the government of Israel, or you're striking a private business. You're trying to basically steer people away because you don't like the people, not because you are actually going to affect the cause that they support. So that's one issue. The other issue is that Skokie has an actual meaning and symbolic resonance in terms of the issues of Jew hatred in America, because and actually, it's a two-edged sword. Okay, so it's a great milestone in freedom of speech, but it's also one of the more lurid examples of people who have decided that they actually don't really want to have any bounds on their hatred. So in the 1970s, there was a Nazi group. I think it was called the National Socialist White People's Party, but I forget which one. Actually, it was the NSPA, the National Socialist People's Alliance or something. It was led by a neo-Nazi named Frank Collin, and he wanted to. He would go to, I believe, it wasn't called Humboldt Park, but it was a park in Chicago itself, and he would march there and oppose school busing, so integration of schools in Chicago, and the integration of neighborhoods. He would say, well, there should be white neighborhoods for white people and black neighborhoods for black people. So at a certain point, he decided, that's not enough. I want to actually go and picket at the home turf of Holocaust survivors. And Skokie, Illinois at the time was the most populated community of Holocaust survivors in at least the state, if not the country. And he demanded a permit, or he wanted to march there. The city demanded that he take out a permit that they wouldn't issue, and it became a freedom of speech case that reached the Supreme Court. And the village of Skokie's case rested on this notion that he couldn't be allowed to march with his followers in Skokie because it would cause a disturbance. There would be violence because the people who live in Skokie wouldn't be willing to see Nazis march so soon after the Holocaust. This was less than, or it was about 30 years after the Holocaust, and a lot of these people had, very clear memories of it. Imagine that you're, let's say, 55 years old, and when 30 years earlier, when you were 25, you were basically a slave laborer in one of these camps in Europe. So they certainly didn't want these people to march in Skokie. Well, ultimately, the court ruled, the Supreme Court, a liberal court, with I think Justice Warren Burger, and the Thurgood Marshall was on the court, and they ruled unanimously in favor of the Nazis, and they said yes, they have the freedom of speech and assembly under the First Amendment, just like anyone else. Well, where did these pro-Palestine demonstrators decide to march? In Skokie. So they're basically following in the footsteps in terms of the First Amendment, in terms of Jew hatred, because they're picketing a Jewish business in Skokie, Illinois, the same community where Nazis decided to litigate for their right to demonstrate against Holocaust survivors and deny the Holocaust. So these are all, very deep topics in terms of the First Amendment and contentious issues. And the First Amendment is meant to protect controversial speech. It's not meant to protect very milquetoast declarations, right? Nobody's threatening your ability to say, I think taxes should be a little lower, or I think we need to raise more money for schools or something. That type of speech is generally run-of-the-mill. People aren't going to file a report against you for saying something like that. But what happens with examples like Skokie is that people decide, because of the heated, the very charged nature of the speech that's being given, they decide, I think that there should be an exception here. These people shouldn't be allowed to demonstrate. That's wrong. I think the Skokie decision was one of the greatest decisions in American history. Even if the people who benefited from it are despicable scumbags, those are ironically the moments that guarantee our rights as people who may disagree with them as Americans. And I think I'm going to, there is one more issue I did want to approach. Okay, so I have a couple more minutes left. The people who really pioneered cancel culture are the pro-Palestine movement. The pro-Palestine movement has been very much locked in on cancel culture over the decades. So years and years ago, the pro-Palestine activists would picket Israeli events and embassies and places like that. There would be, and in fact, back in the 70s, they didn't want there to be any legitimacy to the state of Israel. They didn't want them to be, for example, competing in the Olympics. So what happened was in 1972, in the wake of the Six-Day War. So the Six-Day War had been 5 years earlier. the Palestinians had this organization called Black September. They were an explicitly terrorist organization that was meant to keep the world focused on Palestine as the core issue going on at the time. And their terrorists went to the Olympics in Munich, Germany. So this was the irony that Palestinians always say, well, we're not against Jews, we're against Israelis. But the irony is that they always seem to show up in places where it's a little bit of a coincidence, that they're doing the things they do in places where Jews were either disenfranchised or turned into, basically dehumanized. They were killed or whatever the case is. So they broke into the Olympic Village in Munich and took hostage 11 Israeli athletes. Eventually, all of them were killed. That is cancel culture to the extreme. You're saying, you're going to compete in the Olympics. We're gonna make sure that that's not going to go down without some sort of interference. So the Palestinians did that, and this was approved by the highest leadership of the PLO. Right, the Black September was not officially a part of the PLO. It was basically like an alternate group, but it was an alliance. It was a joint effort by a number of Palestinian terror groups. So, and they had the full approval of the Palestinian leadership. It wasn't necessarily publicly acknowledged, but in the course of history, it's been confirmed that this was an operation that was fully endorsed and supported by the PLO leadership. Well, in more recent times, they have adopted less aggressive tactics. There was the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, and that is explicitly cancel culture. What do? They go to businesses and they tell them, don't sell these Israeli products, whether it's pickles, whether it's hummus. There are Israeli performers that they try to deplatform, musicians and artists and speakers and academics and diplomats and any type of expression that is Israeli. Doesn't necessarily even have to be pro-Israel, but they tried to cancel them. They tried to deplatform them. They are the pioneers of cancel culture. There was a concert several years ago. I think it was in 2015. Might have been 2017, but it doesn't matter. You can look it up. There was the Jewish reggae performer Matisyahu. So some of you might like him. I only know a few of his songs. I don't have a problem with him. He used to be a Hasidic Jew, and now he's become secular, but he's still Jewish. So he doesn't deny his Jewish identity. There was a festival in Spain where the administrator said, well, you can perform here, but we want to know whether you will issue a declaration about your opinion regarding Israeli occupation policies against Palestinians and war crimes and things like that. And that's your condition to perform. So he didn't know exactly to what degree he had to issue this statement. It was compelled speech. They were trying to force him to say something because he was a Jewish performer, to disparage Israel for its policies as a condition for performing. That is cancel culture at its essence. It's worse than venues that have, which I think is also wrong, venues that have canceled performances by Roger Waters, who offers his opinions even though nobody's asking. Nobody cares about Roger Waters' opinions. The Roger Waters' opinions aren't going to make you like the Wall album or not, right? And I think he's lived off of that album for decades. Nobody's ever taken one album from 1980 and made an entire career out of that like John Waters has, and basically everything else he's produced has been crap. So, and I think it's wrong when Roger Waters gets canceled. I think that's cancel culture. When he gets his gigs canceled, even though he's a total idiot and just a lowlife, I believe he has the freedom of speech. He's allowed to perform. Why is it that nobody will say on the pro-Palestine side, let Matisyahu perform. Who cares what his opinion of Israel is? That's not our issue. He's a reggae artist, right? It's because they don't actually believe in freedom of speech. They don't have the principles as real values that they hold dear, unlike some of us who do. And I consider myself to be consistent on the First Amendment. And if you find me to be inconsistent, go ahead and point it out to me, and I'll see whether I'm wrong. And I can admit that I'm wrong. Anyway, please like, share, and subscribe. Also, subscribe to me on all the different social media and video hosting sites that you can find through the link tree in the description. Rumble, BitChute, and Odyssey. My Substack newsletter is there, as is my Subscribe Star if you want to tip me. And have a great day.